Hey, it's been a while since I've talked to you, but I got some information recently about something you might find of interest, and that actually is about vitamin D. I'm out here in my backyard and or on my back porch, and there's a lot of sunlight out. And it's always been interesting to me because I've got a lot of patients that are active outdoors, get a lot of sunlight exposure, as I do, and yet I've run lab tests on many patients, and it's almost epidemic how many people are deficient in vitamin D. And in fact, I ran blood tests on myself recently and found that I was deficient in vitamin D, and that's happened repeatedly, and it's always made me wonder, why is that? I get a lot of sunlight exposure, I do things outdoors, I go paddling, I go running, I go out to Barton Springs and other pools and try and get a lot of healthy sun exposure, and yet my vitamin D levels were deficient, and many of my patients that I run blood work on also have deficient levels. So what's that all about? Well, I went and got some information recently at a really good seminar where we were talking about metabolic activation of vitamin D, and I learned some really interesting information. One of the really interesting things is that vitamin D only gets activated if the sun is over about a 45-degree angle in the sky. So sort of a rule of thumb is that if your shadow from the sunlight isn't shorter than you, then you're not going to really be activating vitamin D in your skin. And through your skin is how we activate vitamin D. You can get very little vitamin D absorbed through dietary sources. It comes from things like fatty oils and fatty fish. You'll probably see it in the highest concentration in things like cod liver oil. But you can't really get much. A whole tablespoon of cod liver oil maybe gives you about 15,000 IUs of vitamin D if it's a good source, whereas say 30 minutes of good sun exposure gives you 20,000 IUs of vitamin D. And that's, generally speaking, a good maintenance dose from the sun. Dietary sources, it gets a little different, but the point being, it's really hard to get from our diet, and we don't tend to get it from sunlight because it's only activated when the sun is higher than 45 degrees in the sky, which at our latitude is probably in between about, say, 10 a.m. and 2 p.m. And I don't know about you, but here in Texas, I generally avoid going out in the sun in the heat of the day at that time, or I'm in the office working or I'm doing other things. I tend to get out and have sunlight exposure in the mornings. I'll go out for a run, or in the afternoons, maybe 4 or 5 p.m. I'll go down to Barton Springs or something like that. And so it really solved that question for me of why were my vitamin D levels deficient? Well, because I don't get sun exposure in those parts of the day. So if you're anything like me, you may well be deficient. If you haven't had your vitamin D levels checked, you should get them checked. It's easy to do. It's a simple blood test. It's a cheap blood test. It's probably maybe $30 to $40 total cost. So if you're paying anything more than that, check it out, because I've run a lot of vitamin D tests, and it's not a hard test to do. And the levels you should look for, your optimal levels are about 50 nanograms per milliliter. So you'll see the ranges on the blood test, and standard ranges in the United States will show the low level range maybe down to about 25. Some labs will say 30. But really optimal levels are closer to about 50 nanograms per milliliter. So if you're anything less than that, it's worth supplementing, as I do now, because I've seen that I'm low consistently and that I'm not getting that kind of sun exposure. So vitamin D is a vitamin that is fat soluble, and like other fat soluble vitamins like A, E, and K, those are all fat soluble vitamins along with vitamin D. The fat soluble vitamins we intake, there's a higher chance of toxicity because they're fat soluble. They can get stored in our fat cells and other places in our body, whereas water soluble vitamins, things like vitamin C, vitamin B, and whatnot, if we get too much of them, we tend to just urinate them out. And so the risk of toxicity with those types of vitamins is much less. You can't get toxic on vitamin D from sunlight. It's more or less biologically impossible. Your body down-regulates or turns down the volume, so to speak, on how much vitamin D it takes in when you start to get too much. And really about 30 minutes of sun exposure in between 10 and 2, enough to just slightly start turning your skin pink. So not burn, but so 20 to 30 minutes will give you about 20,000 IUs of vitamin D. Now, if your skin is darker, if you're elderly, if you're obese, the amount you can absorb goes down. So you have to take those things into account, and obviously you don't want to overexpose yourself in sunlight. Other things that affect it are suntan lotion. So anything with an SPF of say 15 or higher will block 95% of your vitamin D conversion. So even if you're out in the middle of the day, if you're wearing sunblock the whole time, you're really not getting any. Glass also blocks the type of ultraviolet radiation we need to create vitamin D. So getting sunlight in your sunroom, for example, won't cut it. It has to be natural sun exposure, and you need really 30 to 40% skin exposure. So all of your arms, your chest, and whatnot are really great places to make sure you're getting full sun exposure. Don't overdo it. You shouldn't get out there and get burned. Obviously that has health risks too, but it's something worth looking at. So if that has something that's bugged you, or at least not bugged you, if that's something you've wondered about, check into it. Get your vitamin D levels checked, because deficiency symptoms can be basically body aches and pains. Low back pain is a really big one. Fatigue and depression are really high when you're, or have a higher chance of those things when your vitamin D levels are low. So get it checked. If you have any questions, feel free to contact me, and have fun out there. Thanks.